there's a warning worth taking seriously, though not in the way it's usually meant. When people say, "Don't hurt an empath, you'll regret it," they're rarely describing something she'll do to retaliate. They're describing something considerably more reliable and considerably more permanent. What happens automatically, structurally, inside the person who caused the harm, regardless of whether the empath ever does anything at all in response. Today, we're going to trace exactly what this regret actually consists of, why it develops with almost mathematical certainty, and why understanding it changes how you interpret every instance of someone underestimating exactly what they're dealing with when they choose to cause genuine harm to someone with this specific depth of feeling and this specific capacity for perception. Let's start with understanding why hurting an empath specifically produces more reliable consequence than hurting almost anyone else, because this specificity matters enormously for understanding why the warning holds particular weight here. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about what makes empathic perception genuinely distinct. The capacity to sense incongruence between performance and authenticity. The depth of feeling that makes genuine connection possible in ways ordinary relationships rarely achieve. Here's what this specific combination means for anyone who causes her genuine harm. She doesn't simply experience the hurt and move on the way someone with less developed perception might. She processes it thoroughly, accurately, and permanently, arriving eventually at genuine clarity about exactly what happened and exactly what it revealed about the person responsible. This matters because most people who cause harm count, whether consciously or not, on the eventual fading of accurate memory, on confusion or self-doubt, gradually softening the clarity of what actually occurred. An empath's specific capacity for accurate perception means this fading typically doesn't happen the way it might with someone less attuned to detecting the actual pattern underneath surface behavior. The memory remains accurate, the perception remains clear, and this permanence, this refusal to fade into convenient confusion, represents the first piece of the regret this title points toward. Here's the second piece, connecting to something we've traced extensively throughout this entire series. An empath's genuine capacity for connection means whatever was lost through causing her harm represented something considerably more valuable than ordinary relationship. Remember everything we discussed about the specific quality of presence a genuinely healed empath offers: depth without exploitability, warmth without weaponizable neediness, perception that sees clearly and loves anyway when love is genuinely warranted. Someone who causes this specific kind of person genuine harm typically doesn't fully recognize, in the moment, exactly what they're forfeiting. The recognition, when it eventually arrives too late to reclaim what was lost, producing exactly the kind of regret this title describes. And this is where the regret begins becoming more complicated, because what the person eventually realizes isn't simply that they hurt someone who cared about them. They realize they damaged access to a relationship that contained a level of understanding they may not easily find again. This distinction matters enormously because ordinary regret often focuses on the event itself. I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have done that. The regret that follows hurting an empath can become much broader. I didn't understand what I had while I still had it. That realization rarely arrives immediately. In the beginning, the person responsible for the harm may actually feel relieved. They may believe the empath was too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding, too difficult to satisfy. They may tell themselves that someone else will eventually appreciate them more. They may even convince themselves that walking away was the best decision they ever made. This is often how people protect themselves from the immediate discomfort of recognizing that they've caused unnecessary pain. It's easier to criticize the person you've hurt than to confront the possibility that you were careless with something valuable. But time creates distance, and distance changes perception. Once the emotional intensity of the conflict disappears, Certain memories begin returning without the same defensive explanations attached to them. The way she listened, the way she remembered small details, the way she noticed when something was wrong without being told, the way she gave people the benefit of the doubt, the way she could recognize pain beneath anger, the way she tried to understand before judging. At the time, these qualities may have felt ordinary because they were consistently available. Afterward, their rarity becomes much easier to recognize. This is one of the most important psychological principles behind regret. People frequently understand the value of something more clearly after access to it has disappeared. And an empath's presence can be particularly difficult to replace because genuine emotional attunement isn't simply a personality trait someone can imitate for a few conversations. It is a way of relating. It appears in hundreds of tiny moments. The questions they ask, the things they remember, the emotional details they notice, the patience they show when someone is struggling, the ability to sense when words don't match feelings. You can find another person who is kind. You can find another person who is attractive. You can find another person who is intelligent. But finding someone who consistently combines emotional depth, perception, compassion, and genuine investment is considerably more difficult. This is why the regret may grow slowly. At first, the person misses the attention. Then they miss the familiarity. Then they miss the emotional comfort. Eventually, they may realize they miss the person herself. And that distinction matters. Because missing what someone provided is not the same as understanding who they were. Sometimes regret begins as loneliness. Then it becomes recognition. Then it becomes comparison. New relationships begin. New conversations happen. New connections develop. But something feels different. The new person may not notice the same things. They may not understand the same emotional subtleties. They may not tolerate the same behaviors. They may not offer the same level of patience. And suddenly, the qualities that were once taken for granted become painfully visible by their absence. This is where the person may begin mentally revisiting the past. She really did understand me. She was actually trying to help. Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe I misunderstood what she was giving me. These realizations can be uncomfortable because they force a comparison between what was lost and what exists now. But there is an even deeper consequence. The empath herself changes after being hurt. This is something the person responsible often doesn't anticipate. They assume that if enough time passes, the empath will eventually return to being exactly who she was before. But genuine betrayal can permanently change the way she gives access to people. She becomes more discerning, more selective, more aware of inconsistency. She doesn't necessarily become cold. She becomes careful. That distinction is incredibly important. A wounded empath may still love deeply. She may still be generous. She may still believe in people. But she no longer gives everyone unlimited access to those qualities. The person who hurt her may eventually return expecting to find the same woman waiting. Instead, they encounter someone who remembers everything without needing to discuss everything. Someone who can be polite without being emotionally available. Someone who can forgive without reopening the relationship. Someone who can wish them well without allowing them back into the position they once occupied. That can create a particularly painful form of regret. Because the person isn't simply realizing that they lost her. They're realizing that the version of her who trusted them completely is gone, and they cannot demand that version back. Trust cannot be commanded into existence. It has to be rebuilt through consistent behavior, and sometimes the damage has already crossed the point where rebuilding is possible. This is where the warning becomes important. Don't hurt an empath isn't a threat. It's not saying an empath will destroy you. It's not saying she will manipulate you, expose you, or seek revenge. In many cases, she does the opposite. She simply leaves. And that quiet departure can become the most permanent consequence of all. Because revenge keeps two people psychologically connected. Distance breaks the connection. She doesn't need to punish you when she has already decided you no longer belong in her life. She doesn't need to prove that you made a mistake. Your realization becomes your responsibility. This is why the regret can become so profound. There is no dramatic confrontation to blame, no enemy to fight, no ongoing conflict to distract from what happened. There is simply the absence of someone who once offered extraordinary emotional access. And the longer that absence remains, the clearer the contrast can become. Eventually, the person may understand something they could never have understood while they still had her. She wasn't difficult because she cared too much. She was valuable because she cared deeply. She wasn't weak because she forgave. She was strong enough to keep believing in people. She wasn't naive because she saw the best in them. She simply believed that what she gave would eventually be treated with the same respect she gave it. And when that respect never came, she learned the lesson that changes everything. Her empathy was never the problem. Giving it to someone who repeatedly treated it carelessly was. That realization doesn't make her bitter. It makes her discerning. And once that discernment becomes permanent, the person who hurt her may finally understand the true meaning of the regret they never expected. They didn't lose someone because she became cruel. They lost someone because they repeatedly showed her that staying would require her to betray herself. And eventually, she chose herself instead. And this is where the deepest part of the regret finally becomes visible, because eventually the person who hurt the empath may realize that the consequence was never simply losing her presence. The real consequence was losing access to the version of the relationship that existed because she trusted them. Once that trust is gone, everything changes. They may still be able to speak to her. They may still see her occasionally. They may even receive kindness from her. But something fundamental is no longer there. The openness, the unquestioning emotional access, the willingness to believe their intentions before judging their actions, the assumption that there is always another chance. Those things disappear quietly, and that quiet disappearance can be much more permanent than anger. This is why one of the biggest mistakes people make after hurting an empath is assuming that forgiveness means restoration. It doesn't. An empath can forgive you and still never trust you again. She can understand why you behaved the way you did and still decide that she doesn't want to experience that behavior again. She can recognize your wounds without volunteering to be wounded by them. She can genuinely wish you healing while understanding that your healing is no longer her responsibility. This is what emotional maturity eventually teaches her. Compassion does not require access. Understanding does not require proximity. Forgiveness does not require reconciliation. And love does not require self-abandonment. Once those distinctions become clear, the empath becomes extraordinarily difficult to pull back into a relationship that repeatedly harmed her. Not because she has become immune to emotion, because she has finally learned how to separate emotion from decision. She may miss someone and still stay away. She may remember the good moments and still accept the bad ones as reality. She may feel sadness and still refuse to return. This is the point where regret can become especially intense for the person who caused the harm, because they may discover that their memories of the relationship remain emotionally vivid, while their access to the person has completely disappeared. They remember her voice, her presence, her patience, her ability to make difficult conversations feel safe, her willingness to listen when everyone else had already stopped listening. But memories cannot recreate access. And this is one of the hardest realities for someone to accept after losing a genuinely empathic person. You cannot use nostalgia to rebuild trust. You cannot use chemistry to erase betrayal. You cannot use an apology to instantly reverse years of emotional damage. You cannot promise someone a future while refusing to take responsibility for the past. If genuine repair is ever possible, it requires something much more difficult: consistency, accountability, patience, and a willingness to accept that the person you hurt has the right to decide whether they ever want to trust you again. That last part is especially important because sometimes the person who caused the harm wants forgiveness on their timeline. They want immediate closure. They want the empath to say, it's okay. They want the uncomfortable chapter to disappear. But genuine accountability means accepting that the injured person doesn't owe you emotional relief. If she needs distance, you respect it. If she doesn't want to reconnect, you accept it. If she no longer trusts you, you understand that the consequence belongs to you. This is what separates genuine remorse from regret that is primarily about loss. Regret says, I hate that I lost you. Accountability says, I understand why you had to leave. Those statements may sound similar. Psychologically, they are completely different. One centers the person who caused the harm. The other finally makes space for the person who experienced it. And this is where the story becomes much more powerful than the idea of an empath making someone regret hurting her. Because the empath's greatest transformation isn't that she becomes capable of making someone suffer, it's that she no longer needs to. She doesn't need revenge. She doesn't need to prove what they lost. She doesn't need to make them jealous. She doesn't need to display how successful she has become. She doesn't need to wait for them to return. Her life continues, quietly, naturally, without the relationship occupying the center of it. And sometimes that is exactly what creates the strongest realization in the person who hurt her. They expected anger. They expected confrontation. They expected another emotional conversation. Instead, they eventually discover that she has become indifferent to whether they understand. That is a completely different psychological state. Anger still contains connection. Indifference doesn't. Anger says, you still affect me. Indifference says, you no longer determine my emotional direction. This is why the final stage of an empath's healing can look surprisingly peaceful. She isn't constantly talking about what happened. She isn't constantly analyzing the narcissist. She isn't waiting for karma. She isn't checking whether they regret it. She simply becomes increasingly invested in the life that exists beyond the relationship. And this is where the title reaches its deepest meaning. Don't hurt an empath. You'll regret what comes next. What comes next isn't necessarily revenge. It's growth. It's boundaries. It's clarity. It's a version of her that no longer confuses compassion with tolerance. A version of her that recognizes patterns much earlier. A version of her that doesn't spend years trying to convince someone to value what they repeatedly demonstrate they don't value. And perhaps the most painful realization for the person who hurt her is discovering that the very qualities they once took for granted become the qualities they miss most. Her patience, her depth, her emotional intelligence, her ability to see beyond appearances, her willingness to understand. But now those qualities are no longer freely available. They have become protected. Access must be earned, trust must be demonstrated, and consistency must exist over time. This doesn't mean the empath becomes closed to everyone. Quite the opposite. She may become more capable of experiencing healthy love because she finally understands what unhealthy love costs. She begins recognizing that genuine connection shouldn't require constant anxiety, that affection shouldn't come with fear, that disagreements shouldn't threaten someone's entire sense of worth, that apologies should be followed by change, that love should not repeatedly require one person to disappear inside the needs of another. And when she eventually encounters someone who understands these things naturally, the contrast becomes undeniable. Healthy connection feels different. It doesn't require her to constantly decode someone's behavior. It doesn't make her question whether she is too much. It doesn't punish her for having boundaries. It doesn't force her to choose between compassion and self-respect. She realizes that the problem was never that she loved too deeply. The problem was that she once believed depth could compensate for a lack of reciprocity. Now she knows better. And this is the final consequence the person who hurt her may never have anticipated. They didn't destroy her capacity to love. They taught her where not to place it. They didn't make her incapable of trusting. They forced her to become more intentional about who receives that trust. They didn't take away her empathy. They taught her that empathy without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. And once she learns that lesson, the version of her they once had access to cannot simply be summoned back. The person who hurt her may eventually regret every decision that led to losing her. But by then, the empath may already be somewhere completely different emotionally, not waiting, not watching, not wondering, living. And that is perhaps the most powerful ending of all, because when someone hurts an empath and expects her pain to keep her connected to them, they misunderstand the very thing that makes her different. Her empathy may make her stay longer than she should. Her compassion may give more chances than most people would. Her hope may survive longer than it reasonably should. But once clarity finally replaces hope, she doesn't need to destroy anyone. She simply stops returning to what destroyed her peace. And the person who caused the damage is left with something no apology can instantly remove. The knowledge that they once had something rare, treated it as though it were replaceable, and only understood its value after it was no longer theirs to protect. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe.